Hey, welcome back to Starbound. Remember to subscribe to the channel. It's free and it helps us out with the YouTube algorithm. Plus, it lets you know when our 2 videos per day will be posted. Comment down below, follow us, like us, and keep track of the new fun things we have coming up for you here in the future. Of the galaxy's trillions of species, the Fire Rocks was widely considered the most pathetic. Their homeworld, Crassier VIC, was conquered and colonized with minimal resistance by the Joshu, a star people considered quite militarily inept. Indeed, the moon had changed hands many times before that, with each new overlord regarding the forest world as little more than a worthless backwater. Like many other non-sapient species, such as the Terran dog and cat, the Fire Rocks were exported off-world by spacefaring merchants and smugglers, Joshu and otherwise. Those who attempt to make them pets find they make poor ones. Their fluffy-looking fur is actually crystalline growth that leaves glass-like strands lodged in the skin of those that touch them, causing irritation and cuts. In a cruel twist of irony, they possess a unique impulse to nuzzle and run their body along one's leg as a sign of affection. They are also prone to poor health in contracting rare diseases. They tend to cost their owners hundreds of thousands of credits in xeno-veterinarian bills, provided they don't drop dead outright on the ride home from the pet store. Those who attempted to exploit the Fire Rocks for labor were also sorely disappointed. They lack the musculature or work ethic for anything more grueling than fetching a thrown ball a few times. They lacked natural predators on their home world and have never been seen preying upon anything larger than a cockroach, ruling out their use in combat applications. To that point, any command more complex than a few words is lost on them. They are notoriously difficult to train on account of their tendency to forget what they have been taught after a few weeks. Even constant reinforcement is not a guarantee that a taught command will stick. Even the Fire Rock's body itself is not useful. Their pelts fall apart easily after death and cannot be used to make clothing. Their meat sours quickly and tastes a bitter offal. After centuries of attempts, one thing has become clear to those who trade in galactic xenofauna. There is no amount of credits one can pump into the Fire Rocks that will yield anything close to a positive return. Their only redeeming qualities seem to be their cuteness and ineffable agreeableness. Even these are not entirely positive, given that they possess the survival instinct of a damp towel. On worlds where they are not native, even the most ill-adapted predators are able to take advantage of their naivety and score an easy, if unpalatable, meal. The Joshu came to see them as pests. What else could they possibly see them as? They couldn't be sold, eaten, trained, or otherwise. The time came to cede yet more Joshu territory to invaders. This time the humans from the planet Sol 3, or Earth. A consortium of merchants, public health officials, and scientists from across Joshu civilization approached their government with a petition. Friends from among the council. The leader of the petitioners, Shargrak, spoke into his microphone in front of a private hearing convened by the Joshu High Council. They were the governing body of the Star Nation, a shadowy, illiberal clique that ran the nation unelected and unopposed. Hear our petition. We demand the cession of Crassier 6C to the humans be included in our terms of surrender, for the good of our glorious fellow Joshu. Shargrak, is it? One of the members of the clique asked. His face was digitally obscured by shadows and modulated by computers. We have read about your, what is the word, activism? Not a word we come across often, and certainly not one we regard well. Our esteemed Committee on Un-Joshuan Activities has been tracking your little movement quite closely. Though you have not crossed the line into sedition, let this meeting be the last act your petitioners conduct before you disperse and go about your lives, as good citizens should. Another member of the clique chimed in, likewise anonymous. It is a privilege, certainly not a right or entitlement, to be granted an audience in these halls, and a rare one at that. I certainly hope you have come prepared with a very compelling argument as to why we should give up this specific part of integral Joshuan star territory. And, for that matter, why you and your ilk believe you have any say in the affairs of the High Council. Shargrak was unperturbed, staring down the silhouettes of the clique with steely eyes. He bowed his head, not in fear but in respect, and began to speak again. I represent the interest of many disparate trades and professions across our great nation. One specific interest, actually, the Phyrox. A third silhouette spoke. Oh, great. More xenofauna rights agitators? I knew this meeting was a mistake. Shagrak could only give a sigh and laugh. Quite the opposite, council member. The Phyrox have been the scourge of all I represent for centuries. They infest our worlds, pose a health hazard to our hatchlings, and are not worth their constituent atoms, even if they were rearranged into a steaming pile of dung. We have a proposal to pass this burden to our human aggressors and let their empire crumble under the dead weight of these pests. The chamber became silent for a moment. The other representatives of the petitioners, exemplars in their respective fields, sat in anxious silence. The clique conversed among themselves silently, muting their audio feeds to convene. Shargrak only sat in stoic response. Finally, the head of the clique spoke up. We have heard enough. You can tell us nothing we do not already know. A half-dozen servants clad in garments that covered the whole body and obscured their entire face, save for a dense mesh, similar to a Terran burqa. They presented documents to the petitioners present, before bowing and filing out of the room in an orderly fashion. Sign these. What are they? Shargrak questioned, picking up a stylus. You needn't bother with the details. What is important is that they are a promise, that you will tell no one of this meeting or any other business you conduct with the High Council, and that you will withhold no talent or information in fulfilling your duties. Shargrak put down the pen for a moment. So that means... The cool demeanor of the silhouette faded slightly. It spoke more sternly now. You will work with our diplomatic corps to enact this plan of yours. Modified according to our needs, of course. Cancel all prior engagements for the next 6 months outside of your usual work. This is all you need to do. We will procure everything we feel that you need. Do not inform anyone of your assignment, not even your mates or family units, or we will erase you. Utterly. Do I make myself clear? Shargrak bowed his head again, this time so deeply that it bumped dully against the desk. Abundantly so. He picked up the stylus and signed the document, before pressing his nose to the electronic screen it was displayed on to sign it. Analogous to a fingerprint, as all Joshu noseprints were unique. Once all of the petitioners had signed their documents and set down their stylus, bags were placed over their heads and syringes of sedatives were injected into their veins. They were loaded into a transport to be clandestinely transported to their domiciles. High in orbit above Crassier 6C, a delegation of Joshu embarked aboard a lone Terran warship, the UTS Miami. The Miami had been pounding the moon mercilessly for months, shelling Joshu military positions and defenses with tungsten kinetics and low-yield nuclear weapons. Its hangar bays were filled with starfighters that had reduced every attempt at boarding the warship to unrecognizable slag. Shargrak, in the capacity of diplomat of the Joshu High Council, sat behind an 8-inch thick bullet and laser-proof pane of plexiglass. He and his entourage, clad to a man either in a servant's veil or an officer's regalia, were mirrored by their human counterparts. Only, they all wore fatigues, with the exception of one in an unstarched baggy dress uniform. General Graham, I presume. The Joshu finally spoke through a translator. He had rehearsed the human's name for hours the night prior, poring over the awkward transliteration of his human name into the Jokshuan standardized script, a sign of respect predating the days of contemporary universal translation software. Yep, I am he, General Graham said with steepled hands, speaking into a small microphone strapped to his collar. A fly landed on his ribbon bar, spending 10 entire seconds walking across its massive width before he pinched it dead with his fingers. He resumed, the speaker transmitting his voice to the other side of the pane, crackling. You know, usually we have to drop a few A-bombs on y'all's aliens' capitals before you give up your planets. What's with the rush? It reeks of trickery. I'm afraid that's classified, Shargrak said, as reflexively as a blink. His conditioning had served him well, and it didn't help that an entire situation room filled with his kind was monitoring his every move from aboard their shuttle. They tracked his vitals, ran probabilistic simulations to gauge the favorability of his responses, and relayed his lines back to him through an implant in his head. General Graham only narrowed his eyes. He wasn't fond of the opaque treatment. Anyways, I believe y'all had a proposition for me, if memory serves. The diplomat stared at the transcription of the general's words for a moment before slightly correcting. Not I, but the Joshu High Council itself. It is our terms of surrender. He placed a copy of the terms into the table they sat at, which extended through the pane of plexiglass. He shut it and sealed it, and General Graham opened the chamber on his side of the table, after it had replaced the Joshuan atmospheric mix inside with one more suitable to humans, of course. It emerged before the Terran, who put on a pair of reading glasses and made a fretting expression with the corners of his mouth. A pained-looking expression he tended to take on whenever he read something smaller than a billboard. It had been translated into the command language of his vessel, one originating from a large nation on Earth that was now spoken in some form or another on thousands of worlds. General Graham had trouble reading it initially. The font was weird and the type was small. After a few minutes of silently mouthing the terms to himself, he passed it off to a surrogate and returned his gaze to the alien. Shargrak was unfazed. "What say you, Earthling?" he inquired, trying to get his own read on the human. He knew better than to presume he could out-human the xenolinguist watching the video feed of the meeting, but he still tried to see what he could tease from the officer. "Ain't my place to make a decision one way or the other, but it seems pretty damn good to me," General Graham quipped, a wry smile stretching across his face. "Glad you all saw fit to include the Crassier system, along with most of our other claims. And then some. Good stuff. Guess you all saw the writing on the wall." Shargrak glanced at the wall before General Graham put his hands up to reassure him. "Sorry, old Terran expression," Graham chuckled. "I just meant that y'all knew you couldn't keep the system. It's better in our hands anyways. We've seen the kind of gear a Joshu soldier needs to step outside. It'll make a mighty fine human colony one day." "Undoubtedly," Shargrak said. The tinge of resentment in his voice was masked digitally and never made it to the general's ears. He had to eat an entire helping of humble pie on behalf of the High Council and the Joshu at large. Another human expression, but one without a parallel in Joshuan parlance. Now, Shargrak had to do what he had come for. The lie he would deliver would cement the fate of the Fyrox and Joshu alike, hopefully in perpetuity. "No doubt you saw in our terms for Crassier 6C specifically, but there are many artifacts that we wish to escort off-world, as well as important personnel. We insist on overseeing the evacuation efforts ourselves with our own flotillas. We require more ships than would otherwise be allotted." General Graham stopped in his tracks and raised an eyebrow. What an odd thing to insist upon. Hell, what an odd thing to even mention, given the sheer quantity of terms present on the document, many of which dwarf this little detail in importance by several orders of magnitude. But given the swiftness of the Joshuan surrender, he didn't want to risk spoiling the victory by driving them away from the negotiation table. He relayed this sentiment to some of his surrogates before returning his attention to the Xeno diplomat. We will perform random searches of y'all's flotilla for weapons or explosives. Otherwise, we accept this term and all the rest. I give it my conditional approval. It will be reviewed back on Earth. Y'all's hasty surrender is greatly appreciated and has saved many millions of lives. He stood up, and Shargrak was instructed to do the same. In lieu of the usual handshake, General Graham delivered a sharp salute, and Shargrak gave a slight dip of the head, a bow, roughly. Wordlessly, they and their entourages filed out of the divided room. Aboard the flotilla of civilian and disarmed military vessels traveling through the Crassier system, crates upon crates of fire rocks were stacked in cargo holds as tightly as they could be. Aboard the civilian vessels, whatever containers could be found large enough to hold at least one were cobbled together for the journey. Everything from pet carriers to beverage coolers to barrels for industrial chemicals. The military vessels were only marginally more prepared, keeping the Fyrox in modified mobile detention cells intended for sapient captives, as well as ammunition crates and ration boxes. Under strict orders to search the inbound vessels for weapons and explosives, human enforcers scoured a handful of the flotilla from head to toe, searching for even a sharpened toothbrush that could be stuck into an unsuspecting soldier. Alas, every time, they found nothing except supplies in row after row of captive Fyrox. The explanations were different each time. Some said the Fyrox were companion animals for the evacuees, others that they were livestock to feed them. Somehow, perhaps because of the inflexibility of their orders or maybe just plain apathy, the humans never saw fit to relay their findings very high in their chain of command. After all, who cared about a few animals? They were native to the world anyway. Upon landing, the Joshu unloaded the containers into clearings in the forest of the sparsely populated moon. The cargo holds were quickly vacuumed and sanitized, and the ships left with throngs of Joshu personnel and their personal effects. The few that elected to stay, perhaps unwilling to face the dishonor of returning home after military failure, opened the crates of Fyrox when, and only when, the refugee flotilla had disappeared over the horizon. In their wake were left piles of rubbish in crates and packs of Fyrox. Some fled into the woods, while others stuck around their crates, grooming themselves or chasing each other. Though this scene played out mostly the same across the wooded moon, it did not go smoothly in every instance. "Get off of me, pathetic little cur!" The bulky Joshu thug punted the small Fyrox, attempting to cling to his leg, leaving the creature wheezing at the base of a purple tree. It struggled to get up, but the soldier aimed his weapon at it as he backed up onto his shuttlecraft. "Easy, easy, don't do anything stupid, or I swear by my lucky stars I'll blast you. Now, get lost." The shuttlecraft roared away, leaving the Fyrox craning its neck at the alien sky above. It curled up in a ball, breathing shakily under a sky it had never laid eyes on before. "Masters?" he thought to himself, watching the shuttle become a smaller and smaller mote of gray in the distance until it disappeared from view entirely. The environment he found himself in was entirely unfamiliar, a far cry from the air-conditioned condo on Joshu Prime he was sunning himself in the window of a mere week ago. He had half a mind to cry, or to sit and wait for the shuttle to come back. But his stomach growled. He hadn't had anything to eat in hours. A Joshu guard had fallen asleep while on duty, and he managed to eat half of her sweet ration through the bars of his crate. He had always been rather food-motivated. Instinctively, he knew to travel to the sound of running water. He trotted deeper into the forest and spotted a creek running between black rocks covered in purple moss. Beside it, he saw a fellow Fyrox sitting before an old-looking machine patiently. "What's your name?" he asked the seated animal sitting next to him. The other Fyrox did not take his eyes from the machine or even really acknowledge his approach at all. "Crack, crack," he chittered. breaking his statuesque gaze to bat at the side of the machine. It did not respond, remaining silent and still. Nice to meet you, Crack Crack. My owner called me Gashar. Crack Crack blinked, but his attention remained undivided. You do not have a Firefox name. Gashar turned his head to face him. If I do, I have forgotten it. The two sat in silence for another few minutes before Gashar asked, What are you waiting for? Treats. This machine dispenses them if I sit in front of it long enough. Crack Crack responded with haste. Go away. I am not sharing. Gashar noticed a pile of cans nearby, each having a conspicuously Firefox-shaped bite mark on it. They were drained empty, yet the opener tabs atop them were untouched. Insects buzzed around them, hoping to collect what little beverage remained on the walls of the cans. He sniffed them, and they were not unlike the Joe Shoe sweet ration he could still taste lodged in his teeth. When was the last time it gave you anything? He asked Crack Crack, returning to the patient animal's side. Crack Crack hesitated before answering. 7 nights ago. And before that, 3 nights, I think. And then, before that, also 3 nights. Gashar got up and walked away. He was not nearly as patient as his new acquaintance. But as he was almost out of sight, Crack Crack called out, Your scent is unfamiliar. It is like that of the off-worlders. I can hardly even smell you at all, and I have never seen you before. What are you? Not who, but what. This puzzled Gashar. He did not answer, but reflected on the line of questioning levied toward him. Perturbed, he left Crack Crack to his own devices, seeking food elsewhere. Though he had always been fairly well fed back home on Joe Shoe Prime, he also dined on the household pests that would occasionally make their way into his owner's hab unit. He was not an apex predator, but he at least knew that he could get food if there was no bowl, and no sapient to pour xenokibble into it. Bracing himself for a long day of scrounging, he began to overturn rocks and peek into logs in search of a meal. And here we see a firefox turning over rocks in logs, trying to find grubs to sustain his life. Yes, as I was saying, the situation is strange. Technically, the firefox are almost sapient beings, seeming to miss the cutoff no matter which tests out of the thousands devised across the Milky Way are conducted, including our own. As such, they are not considered proper subjects under galactic law. However, they can speak and reason to an extent, though this is largely instinctive and untaught. Limited headway into deciphering their chitters and squeaks is said to have been made by the Joe Shoe. General Graham stopped the scientist's explanation in his tracks, hunching down behind some foliage. He pointed to a fluffy figure in the distance by a creek, directing the scientist's attention towards it. Shit, Jessica, I think that's one of them little critters right there, he said, readying his rifle. You sure they ain't liable to bite? Indeed it is, General, and no, they won't bite. Not unless you cover your hand in peanut butter and shove it in their mouth, the scientist responded. A famed human xenobiologist from Alpha Centauri, Jessica Laramie, had been summoned to Crassier 6C at the behest of Earth's government to investigate the local wildlife. She shared in General Graham's love of animals and the outdoors, though admittedly he had a quite sophomoric understanding of either, in her opinion. Well, that's good. Don't want space rabies, the general joked, letting the barrel of his rifle droop. He walked over to the creature with Jessica, and they stood over it silently. Oh, another dead one, Jessica muttered, jotting something down in her clipboard. I don't get it. It looks uninjured and is surrounded by potential food sources. What gives? Didn't you go to that fancy-pants university to answer that exact question? I don't know what you're asking me for, Graham scoffed. He nudged the fire rocks with the tip of his boot before noticing the vending machine in front of it. It was overgrown with vines which covered the solar panel it used to operate. A broken-off charge card was crammed into the card reader. Huh. I'm no forensics expert, but I think I can piece together what happened. Little critter got addicted to canned pop. Sat here and starved right to death waiting for another one. Jessica bunched up the fabric in her sleeve and used it to wipe the mud and dust from the glass of the vending machine. Sure enough, it was empty, save for a single can, which seemed to have dispensed but got stuck between the shelf and the glass. Wow, that's just cruel. Poor baby starved to death waiting for his can. It's just a law of the jungle, I guess, General Graham said with a shrug. He nudged the xenobiologist aside and put his whole body into a kick that rocked the vending machine. The can didn't budge. Shaking his head, he kicked it a few more times until the can clattered out of its resting place and out of view. Excitedly, he opened the pickup box to retrieve his sugary beverage, only to find a Fyrox and its young huddled inside. It hissed at him as he tried to grab the can of soda, causing him to sigh in frustration. Some jungle, Miss Laramie laughed, putting her hand in front of her mouth and giggling. What, you'll take an entire star system to claim for humanity, but taking some soda from an animal for yourself is a bridge too far? That is an interesting ethical distinction you make. Yeah, whatever, General Graham muttered. After a few moments, he pursed his lips. How are they gonna get out of there? Those things aren't very easy to escape from. The door only opens inward. I've seen enough hollow video compilations to know that. Miss Laramie shook her head, putting on some thick gloves and reaching into the pickup box. There we go, nice little kitty, she cooed quietly, cornering the Fyrox with her outstretched gloved hands. Then she grabbed it in a quick motion, mindful to remove it carefully from the vending machine. It made no noise, but tried to wiggle out of her grasp to no avail. She handed it to a research aide who placed it inside of an animal carrier. The kits were placed in another carrier beside it, scooped out one by one until the vending machine was entirely empty. The humans returned to their vehicle, a 6-wheeled personnel carrier that had been loaned from the UTS Miami's planetary assault detachments. They loaded the Fyrox in the back, and General Graham lit up a cigar, letting it hang from the side of his mouth. Remind me again what y'all are doing with these little critters? The general inquired, leaning against the side of a tree. He had a vague idea that Jessica Laramie and her team were with a conservation effort. Hell, he was the one who officially approved of their mission in the first place, being the military governor of Crassier 6C, but he forgot the specifics of this expedition in particular. Well, we are trying to tag and vaccinate as many Fyrox as we can. We have it on good authority that the Joshu dumped as many Fyrox as they could here onto Crassier 6C under the guise of their evacuation from the planet. A man in fatigues piped up. It's true, General. We have footage of them letting thousands of Fyrox loose from their ships and then filling them with their own personnel. Those bastards lied to me, General Graham grumbled, throwing his cigar down and putting it out with an angry twisting of his boot. Although I could not have anticipated this, out of all of the alien tricks and traps I've seen in my time on the UTS Miami, this is new. Can't exactly call it bioterrorism. The little critters are native to the world. It was like a very large, very inconvenient family reunion. Jessica Laramie pushed her glasses further onto the bridge of her nose, clearing her throat. Not the nomenclature I'd use, but I'm inclined to agree with your sentiment. The xenobiologist concurred with pause. But think of it, General. What an opportunity the Joshu have given us. They've shunt the Fyrox onto us as a burden, and from what I've gathered, every other Xeno has regarded them the same way. So, what do you propose? General Graham asked, folding his arms. Well, if everyone else shunned these poor little things, I think it's our place as humans to show the galactic community the best side of the Fyrox. If no one else will take them in, we'll steward their homeworld the best we can. She could see she was losing General Graham a bit, so she added, I'm sure the tourism alone could justify the endeavor, Governor Graham. After all, people still go to Antarctica to see the penguins, and to Africa to see the lions. Graham nodded his head at this. He closed his eyes, clearly considering the proposition. After some contemplation, he spoke up. Well, tell you what, if it means sticking it in the craw of the Joshu High Council, I'll personally see to it we make this happen. Public relations seems to be half my job these days anyways. Might as well put it toward a good cause. A few years later, the UTS Miami docked into its slip high in the orbit of Mars. A large neo-nylon tarp covered a large portion of the bow on either side. For the first time in human history, live fire rock specimens were being brought to the Sol system for the Grand Martian Exposition. Entrance ships from across the human space and associated client states were pouring into the Martian spaceport, but none so grand as the Miami. It would clearly be one to remember. With bated breath, spectators watched the Miami from the spaceport windows and from live holo video feeds. At the end of a countdown, reminiscent of a New Year's Eve celebration, the tarps were rolled up from the warship's hull to the cheers of exposition goers. It bore a seal of a dozen different xenofauna set in a grassy field, with a Phyrox being held by a woman at the heart of the emblem. In 5 languages, the text around it read, "Celebrating 25 years of Martian xenobiology and human excellence, ad astra." From an executive suite in the spaceport spires, Graham and Laramie sat in lounger chairs. Graham spoke first after the commemorative emblem was unveiled. "Ha! The paintbrush really does add 10 pounds, he guffawed, earning him a playful punch in the arm from Jessica. He continued, "Let's hope we make a big splash at the exposition. If we put Crassier 6C on the map, that moon of ours will be swarming with tourists in no time. Let's not forget what we're really fighting for, General," Jessica tutted. She put on thick gloves and scooped a Phyrox from the ground. On his collar in Joshu script was printed the name Gashar. Jessica petted him, mindful to stay with the grain of his crystal fur and to not get any shed on her outfit. "If we play our cards right, these wonderful little things won't be cast aside again. Not if we can help it." The two descended downstairs after a glass each, promising to rendezvous afterwards. They had panels to speak at and exhibits to view for themselves, after all. The general diverged to speak at a meet and greet, and Jessica deigned fit to head to the Phyrox exhibit her team had just finished setting up. She brought coffee for the overworked scientists and understudies. "Hey, gang, anything interesting happened while I was watching the unfurling ceremony?" Miss Laramie asked, setting down the iced cups of caffeinated goodness on the fold-out table before her. A pimple-ridden intern answered, not looking up from her clipboard. Yeah, I'd say. Some xeno creep keeps eyeballing our specimens. Go shoo him away. He probably thinks they're food or something." Miss Laramie tissed. "Hey, cool it with that. Not very sensitive of you, but sure, I'll go speak with him, see what he wants." She approached the alien in question. He wore a full-body environment suit to compensate for his lack of adaptation to the exhibit hall's atmospheric mix. Through a translator embedded in his helmet, the Joshu exposition goer asked, "Are you the one they called Jessica Laramie?" "I am she. May I help you?" Jessica asked the Joshu, who had been staring into the Phyrox enclosure. "I can't believe it. You humans actually managed to find a use for these things. I still remember when my own collection of them was seized by the High Council and sent to the Crassier system." He shook his head, turning away from the glass. "I was a scientist, if you cannot tell. We were so close, this close to cracking their language. And my colleague, he kept sending in patents to spin their fur into cheap, renewable insulation. Each one kept getting ignored until he disappeared one day." Uncharacteristically among his kind, he stuck out his hand to shake Miss Laramie's. She took off her gloves and went along with the gesture. "I am shocked," she admitted. "Very tight tabs are kept on you Joshu by your government. In what capacity are you here?" "I understand if you don't recognize me. I'm the janitor on the Miami these days," the alien answered. "I am one of the Joshu that stayed on Crassier 6C after the High Council surrendered. I couldn't bear to leave the Phyrox behind and join a guerrilla cell to fight the human occupation. It was only after I saw a holo video of your team's conservation efforts that I surrendered and sought amnesty. in order to one day work with the Fyrox again under human paymasters. I guess you aren't all bad after all. Miss Laramie chuckled before catching herself. Sorry, you know what I mean. The poor things have been through hell and back. I guess you and they are similar, no? Just misunderstood. The janitor sneered. Hardly. Everyone seems to have a good read on us. It's the Fyrox none of us have seemed to appreciate until now. Rebecca Laramie smiled. A Joe Shoe, singular as though he might have been, could recognize the worth of the Fyrox. This was the final proof positive she needed to vindicate her success. Come meet with me after the exhibition. I'd love to compare notes, Miss Laramie offered, giving a cordial nod to her alien counterpart. Plainly, the performance of the Fyrox was abysmal. They were the only xenofauna to have an attrition rate at the agility course, for one. They also had poor showings at the races, memory tests, and every other event, save for one. Their cute visage let them sweep the critter pageant, being crowned Mars's favorite critters. It was an upset, to be sure. It was the first time such an otherwise feeble creature had won the pageant. Pictures of Gashar wearing his pageant sash were plastered all across the human news net, spawning a small but dedicated community devoted to following his exploits, as well as those of Jessica Laramie and her conservation team. And after some time, even the most hermetically sealed information quarantines and firewalls were no match for the star power of little Gashar, the cutest critter in the galaxy. The galactic community that kept the Fyrox at an arm's length for centuries now bent to their magnetic cuteness, a hard-won conquest of man and Fyrox kind alike. And here we see a Fyrox drowning in a puddle,